had a phone call recently from some people up in Tennessee, near Chattanooga, and the people said to me that they had gotten the book Secret Terrorist and Enemy Unmasked at their church, and they had taken them home, and they before they started reading them, they prayed and said, "Lord, if this is truth, then show it to us. If it isn't, then show us that too." And so this couple went home and had that prayer, and they started reading, and they said they went from cover to cover with both books. They started reading them to their adult children, and they said everything in the books was true, and it was right in line with the great controversy. And they said, "Bill, why don't we hear these messages in Adventism today? Why aren't these messages that are in the Secret Terrorist and the Enemy Unmasked, why aren't they being proclaimed from pulpits in Seventh-day Adventist churches?" And I said, "Well, you asked, so I'll tell you." Because, folks, that's not the focal point of what I want to share with people. We've got a world to warn. We've got a gold mine that God has given to us. And we need to share it with every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. And we're the only ones that can. And you know, I get letters from people all over the world, from people that we would class as heathens, to people in other churches, to Seventh-day Adventists. And we don't realize that for at least 3 generations now, at least 3 generations, Seventh-day Adventists have not been taught our messages. Do you realize that? For at least 3 generations, ever since the writing of Questions on Doctrine back in the mid-1950s. The messages we've been given as a people have been gutted. Well, these folk, they said, "Bill, why don't we hear these messages anymore?" And so I read them a statement, and I want to read it to you from Great Controversy. Great Controversy, page 234, pages 234 and 235. It said, "Throughout Christendom, the context for this statement is around the 1530s, 1540s. It's 10 years after Martin Luther stood at the Diet of Worms with Charles V in the Holy Roman Empire and said, 'Here I stand, I can do no other.' That is the context in which this statement is made. Throughout Christendom, Protestantism was menaced by formidable foes. The first triumphs of the Reformation past, Rome summoned new forces, hoping to accomplish its destruction. At this time, the order of the Jesuits was created the most cruel, unscrupulous, and powerful of all the champions of popery. Cut off from earthly ties and human interest, dead to the claims of natural affection, reason and conscience wholly silenced, they knew no rule, no tie but that of their order, and no duty but to extend its power. The gospel of Christ had enabled its adherents to meet danger and endure suffering undismayed by cold, hunger, toil, and poverty, to uphold the banner of truth in face of the rack, the dungeon, and the stake. To combat these forces, Jesuitism inspired its followers with a fanaticism that enabled them to endure like dangers, and to oppose to the power of truth all the weapons of deception. There was no crime too great for them to commit, no deception too base for them to practice, no disguise too difficult for them to assume. Vowed to perpetual poverty and humility, it was their studied aim to secure wealth and power, to be devoted to the overthrow of Protestantism and the reestablishment of the papal supremacy. So why was the Jesuit order raised up in the 1540s? Two purposes: to destroy everything that Protestantism had done, and to reestablish the power of the papacy in the world. Those were their two goals, their two purposes. Now, the question I asked these dear people on the phone, I said this: why was the Seventh-day Adventist Church raised up? Why were Seventh-day Adventists raised up in and around 1844? You say, well, to give the three angels messages, and absolutely that's true. We were called in the process of history to finish the Protestant Reformation. Is that not true? So if we were called to finish the Protestant Reformation and the Jesuit order was raised up to destroy Protestantism, where would the Jesuit order and the Catholic Church turn all their cannons of deception to try to destroy? Where would they point them? They would point them at Seventh-day Adventism. And how would they destroy Seventh-day Adventism? You say, well, they'd infiltrate. Well, of course they would. They would infiltrate into positions of leadership, teachers, pastors, administrators. You know, I could tell you a few stories, and I will at this moment. Back as early as the 1940s, a man by the name of B.G. Wilkinson, who wrote a book called Truth Triumphant, was the president of Emmanuel Missionary College in Washington, D.C. Now it's known as Columbia, or CUC. B.G. Wilkinson one day was in his office, and some theology students came by and said, Dr. Wilkinson, the new professor of religion is teaching some very strange things in our theology classes. He's doubting the fundamental teachings of our church. Dr. Wilkinson said, okay, I'll keep my eyes open. Several days later, Dr. Wilkinson was walking by the little mailbox cubby holes for the different teachers. And all of a sudden a voice said, pull the mail out of the new theology teacher's mailbox. Dr. Wilkinson said, I don't do that kind of thing. The voice said, take the mail out of his box. Dr. Wilkinson did. And in there he found a piece of mail from a leading Catholic university in Washington, D.C. He opened it up, and in there were directives to that teacher on exactly how he was to confuse and mislead those Seventh-day Adventist young men training for the Adventist ministry. That was in the 1940s. 3 years ago, I had some meetings in Portland, Oregon, and a lady stood up in the meeting and she said, I'd like to share a story. She said, I have a dear friend who lives on the East Coast. She said several years ago, she took a friend of hers, a devout Roman Catholic, to the hospital cafeteria right there near the General Conference in CUC. The two women sat down to eat lunch. The Catholic woman was there eating. She turned to her Seventh-day Adventist friend and gasped and said, what are they doing here? The Adventist woman turned to her Catholic friend and said, sweetheart, are you pointing towards those two men over there? And the Catholic woman said, yes, those two men right there. What are they doing in this Adventist cafeteria? The Seventh-day Adventist woman said, Dear, those are two Seventh-day Adventist ministers in the General Conference. They have very high positions in the General Conference. The Catholic woman looked at her Adventist friend and said, "No, they're not. Those are two Roman Catholic priests." The two men, Leroy Froome and Roy Allen Anderson. Now, folks, those two men were instrumental in the putting together of the book Questions on Doctrine, which many Seventh-day Adventists who lived in the late 1950s and into the 1960s said that that book was the raping of Seventh-day Adventism. Because in that book, they change our view on the nature of Christ when He came to this world. They said that He took on a nature like Adam before He fell. They changed our concept of end-time Bible prophecy. They stated that the full atonement took place at the cross, that Christ was no longer making atonement in the heavenly sanctuary, thereby gutting our understanding of atonement in 1844. Folk, Roy Allen Anderson and Leroy Froome were instrumental in destroying Adventist belief. And that is one of the reasons why Adventism is in the position it's in today. Finally, these dear folk in Tennessee, they said, "But Bill, you know, okay, those are stories from the past, but you have no proof of anything that's going on today that would say that the Jesuits have infiltrated into Adventism. You know, Froome and Anderson, they're gone." Well, I will challenge every single person in this room to go to any major Seventh-day Adventist website and look up the educational history of the current General Conference president. Okay? You do it. You do it. Jan Paulson, do you know where he got his doctorate degree? He got his doctorate degree at Tübingen University in Germany. Tübingen University was raised up by Philip Melanchthon, Martin Luther's right-hand man during the Protestant Reformation. You say, well, then Tübingen is a great Protestant school. Folks, this is the 21st century. Tübingen University today is the hotbed of ecumenism. The most prolific Jesuit scholars on ecumenism in the world teach at Tübingen University. In fact, Joseph Ratzinger, the current Pope, taught at Tübingen University. He left there in 1967. Jan Paulson started taking his doctorate degree in 1968. Now I ask you today, did Jan Paulson learn at this Jesuitical, ecumenical university, was he confirmed in his convictions to preach the three angels' messages? No. He was trained in how to bring Seventh-day Adventism into the ecumenical movement. That's what he was trained to do at Tübingen University. You say, but Bill, Jan Paulson as a Seventh-day Adventist pastor, as a president, he certainly would never stand for anything but the truths of Revelation 14. Well, Ellen White says differently.